Excellent. So now we are so thrilled and excited to welcome Better Scientific Software Fellow Peter Williams to talk about his work creating this resource called One Good Tutorial. And with that, we'll give the floor over to Peter. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And hopefully in a minute you'll be able to see a title page.
Yes, now we can.
Yeah, I think there's a little latency. All right, so yeah, thanks for having me and happy to talk to you about this project I've been working on as part of this BSSW fellowship. Um, so I'll just plunge right in. So by introducing myself a little bit more, my name is Peter Williams. I'm the technical lead at the IU Minor Planet Center. We're the world's one-stop shop for gathering and distributing observations of asteroids, comets, other things floating around the solar system. So that basically means that I'm managerially responsible for software that is the difference between civilization ending in a fiery cataclysm and not that, potentially. Very small chance, but non-zero. Um, my background is in astrophysics research. I'm an observational radio astronomer, but I also have a long history of working in the open source world, even longer than I've been a scientist. I've been involved in a lot of projects. I was a member of the Conda core team for a while, and that informs a lot of how I approach science and a lot of what I do. Um, since we're here, I'll mention that I would like to think of myself as someone who is, tries to be thoughtful about user experience and user-centered approaches to building things. I'm certainly an amateur at that, though. Um, and yeah, so I had this fellowship which funded me to work on a project relating to documentation. And overall, I like to say that, documentation, it's it's interesting. Like I personally find that when you find something that has great documentation, it's really great. Like it makes me feel happy as well as, I have, for instance, this I use this command line accounting software called Bean Count, which has really great documentation that has I've learned more about accounting thanks to this. Like I think accounting is fun now, which is part of that's my general personality, but the documentation like explains financial concepts in ways that help me understand them better. Um, on the other hand, creating that documentation is a lot of work. It can be, very, very difficult. It's frustrating if you've ever sat down to start trying to document something. Um, it's intimidating. Um, so I think, it's not hard to understand why we have this combination of things. Fundamentally, documentation is education. You're trying to teach people something. I would say this is pretty well established as one of the major unsolved problems of human civilization. Teaching people things is hard in any format, let alone kind of when we're talking about these sort of prose text or other kinds of non-interactive situations. But beyond that, if you're creating documentation, you're designing something, you're choosing fonts, layouts, user experience designs. There's this large design component of how you deliver all that material. And then there's actually building it. A sophisticated piece of documentation, even if it's a web page, you can think of it as a web app. Like there's non-trivial engineering to make things like code syntax highlighting or runnable code in the browser possible. So like this is as hard a challenge as you can find anywhere else in terms of building something. Um, so we're not going to solve it. We're not going to, uh, I don't believe that we're ever going to be able to say, okay, LLM, go build my docs and it will do all this for you. Like there's inevitably work and toil involved. But that being said, there's probably ways to reduce that amount of work and make it easier for people. Um, so I think when I approached this project, with a little bit of retroactive shoehorning, I would say centering the user is the way to sort of think about how do we get a better result. But this raises the question of who are we talking about here? So certainly, in the end, documentation is read by people. We want those people to have a good experience. And, what the way to deliver something that does that is to really think about them throughout the design of those documentation elements that we're delivering. But my project, I have sort of a different user The people who I'm targeting are the people who are writing the documentation, the people who are sometimes they're also the developers. Maybe a project has enough resources where there's some kind of split between maybe the developer and other people who would be writing documentation. Um, and these people, my project is sort of, it's more focused on them, and they have needs too. And the design that I'm thinking about is more aimed at what is doing right by that community that then allows them to do right by the ultimate consumers of whatever documentation they're producing. So for me, I ended up gravitating to what I ended up calling a minimum viable documentation product, or MVDP. So you may be familiar with this more general concept of a MVP, minimum viable product. The Wikipedia definition is a version of a product with just enough features to be usable by early customers who can then provide feedback for future product development. So the basic idea is get something out there that is the least you can get away with as quickly as possible is usually paired with that, and then iterate from there. And I like this mindset because, first of all, it's realistic in the sense that most projects, you are going to be very lucky if you have any explicit time carved out for writing documentation, let alone resources or money, people, staff, whatever. And also this establishing this idea that we're targeting something to start. Maybe it will end there. Hopefully, it will go on to something that grows and evolves, but it really is helpful to start with, okay, this is like the minimum that we need. And when we've got that, we'll put it out there, we'll potentially revisit it, we'll evolve it from there. But setting that goalpost for the initial effort, I think, is really important. So you can think of this as this kind of framework gives you social permission to say, all right, this is good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be completely comprehensive. Um, what is something that we're going to say, I recognize that this is not complete. This is could be better, but I've been, we all agree nothing is ever complete, nothing's ever perfect, so let's call it good enough. So this kind of leads to the question, can we define this minimum viable documentation product in a way that is actually generic enough? So I'm particularly targeting scientific software, but something that is actually useful depending on whether you're working on genomics code or numerical code or physics or whatever your field might be. And unsurprisingly, I contend yes. So to sort of start that conversation, if you look out into the general tech world or really any kind of commercial service, everyone has a button called Get Started on their website. If whenever there's like installing a piece of software, there is a great deal of empirical and I'm sure backed by theoretical evidence that this is the most important thing is you give people this on-ramp to starting to use your product. So in my terminology, that is one good tutorial. That is the most important thing is you need to give people this tutorial. Um, I also write that's online because implicit in what I'm talking about here is that the ultimate form factor of your documentation is web content, essentially. Maybe static HTML, maybe something a little bit more classy, but something that people access through a web browser. I would argue that essentially that is the only form factor worth targeting. Um, One can have a broader conversation about that. But being able to go to a website and access something uh, that is the primary way that people access things. And also, modern web browsers, you can create rich multimedia applications. You can embed computation. You can do whatever you need. Like there's almost nothing that you can imagine doing that can't be done in a web browser if that's what you're targeting. Um, so why the tutorial in particular? So especially when we're talking about a new project, sort of something that is aiming at this minimum viable stage, this is the thing that your new or your potential users are going to be looking for. They don't know how to use your software. They don't even really understand, they might have a sense of what they think it's for, but they don't necessarily truly understand what it's actually for. And the goal of the tutorial is to essentially fill that in a way which, if you think of it from a marketing mindset, you can think of it as driving conversions as robustly as possible. How do we turn potential users, people who are curious about your software, into actual users who know how to use it? And I think a second order benefit of this is that you build trust. If someone visits your project and they see, okay, here's a tutorial. They've shown me how to get started. That tutorial works well. It's easy, pleasing. Uh, that is a very good thing that you can't always expect. And if people do experience that, they will say, all right, these people seem like they know what they're doing. I have trust in them. And that trust will, people will overlook things that you think are like the worst, most glaring problems later. But if you've kind of given them that good initial experience and they say, all right, yeah, I like what these people do. It is amazing what people will forgive if you can get over that initial hump. Um, so the other thing I like about the tutorial mindset is it is why are we calling this a tutorial and not a generic piece of documentation? I would say that it is because we are thinking about it in a user-centered way. We're saying, we're imagining there is a new user, we're structuring the whole thing for this particular uh, use case. And I think that approaching our documentation in this user-centered mindset helps guide us throughout the process of creating documentation. And honestly, this is something that a lot of people, when they think about, I need to write documentation for my software, they often think, okay, well, I'm in Python, I'm using Sphinx, I have to write API docs because Sphinx is an API doc tool. And they sort of just kind of think of documentation as essentially predominantly about things like APIs and module structures and things like that. And I think emphasizing the tutorial is a really good way to point out that's kind of backwards. We should think about the people who are going to be using the software and then think about what are their needs and how do we try to meet them. So if you're familiar with this area, you may not be surprised that I will reference, there's this thing called diataxis, which is sort of a conceptual framework by a guy, Vincent Pouillet. It has a website, diataxis.fr, which is a sort of intellectual tool. He describes it as a way of thinking about and doing documentation. And the core argument of diataxis, which I certainly uh, very much agree with, is that we can think of there being different kinds of documentation. Diataxis in particular specifies four in this kind of quadrant scheme. Um, so the argument is that we classify people by along this kind of acquisition of skill versus application of skill axis and cognition versus action, how proactive we're being. So tutorial is aimed at someone who is, they're trying to learn a skill, but we're learning by doing. We're teaching them hands-on. And I think this gets into the general question of how do we educate people, but hands-on learning seems to be pretty effective. In contrast, Diataxis defines a how-to guide as being we're also doing something, but unlike a tutorial, it's I am trying to solve a problem right now. When I'm doing a tutorial, I don't even really know what problem I could be solving. Whereas once I've learned the software a little bit, I have some problem, I'm trying to solve it, and the how-to guide is like, all right, here's what you do when you know that you need to calculate a synchrotron spectrum of a thermal particle distribution. Um, Reference information, that's kind of the traditional API docs, is really only one quadrant in this model. And I think I really like that perspective of sometimes you need to know what are the allowed parameters, values of this particular parameter, this particular function, dry, basic, boring. Sometimes that is what you need, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. And the fourth quadrant is this idea of explanation of sometimes I'm trying to learn about the area, but I'm not actually really trying to solve any particular problem right now. I just want to understand things better. So this is like when my bean count financial software documentation has a section on unrealized capital gains and how to understand that. Like there are times when you're not really doing anything right now, but you're just trying to learn more. Um, so I like this, I would say, and I think the Diataxis write-up echoes this is a user-centered approach. These kinds of documentation map to different needs of users. And there's a lot of really good write-ups in the Diataxis system about sort of how to think about writing a good tutorial, a lot of details to go along this framework. It's certainly not perfect or comprehensive, but I think it's a powerful tool that if you're thinking about documentation, it's something to have in your toolbox. That being said, it doesn't really help you write your documentation, and that's what I'm more focused on. So in its own terminology, you could say that diataxis, it's an explainer. It's talking about here's how to think about documentation, here are ways to reason about it, but it's not holding your hand. Diataxis does not talk about what should your landing page look like, what tool should you use, should should you make different decisions. It's much more abstract than that. It's not helping you actually get things done. It's helping set the scene. Um, and so what I worked on was more in the diataxis taxonomy of a how-to guide, more of a, okay, like let's actually get something done. I know what I need to do. I need to write some docs, but I don't know how to get started. So the result is this resource called One Good Tutorial. It's got the website right there. And so as I've said before, like I believe One Good Tutorial is the key, most important single one thing, and I believe that so much that I made it the name of the whole resource. Hopefully it's nice and memorable, and if you only remember one thing, those three words, I hope, are the most important ones. So once we get beyond that, the main thing that it'll provide right on the homepage is a checklist, which is effectively my definition of this minimum viable product. So it's got 9 elements, and my claim is that for scientific software, these are the 9 things that you need to think about for like the least documentation you can get away with. So just to go through them. The first one is synopsis, some kind of short summary of what the project is. You need to tell people, some people will land on your webpage, they don't know what it is at all. You need to tell them something's short. Next item, tutorial. As I've been saying, like you need to give people who are wannabe potential users, you need to show them what your software actually does, what it's like to use. Most of the rest is basically housekeeping stuff that, for instance, a lot of these you can think of them in the diataxis framework, but something like contact information, I think it's important if there's something that documents your software, especially when you're a new project where you might not have a whole system of support. People, you should tell people who's in charge of this thing, how do I talk to them? Any question that they have will probably boil down to talk to whoever, talk to somebody particular. So you can shoehorn this into the diataxis framework, but my claim is this is something that you should have regardless. And you know, we're not saying, oh, this is a tutorial in communication with the author. This is just an element that you should have. Installation instructions. So I want to emphasize that these are things that you should think about. If your software is, say, some kind of web service, this might not really be relevant, but you at least want to think about, is there something of this nature that we should tell people? And in most cases, if it is installable software, that's going to be one of the top needs, again, of a new user. Citation instructions. This is one of the elements that's special to scientific software. If we are writing scientific software, I feel strongly that we should do what it takes to make our software citable. It turns out the instructions of how to cite your software might end up being quite brief. The work to make your software citable can often be a lot longer. So this is, the actual number of words here might be not that much, but the work involved, if you haven't done this before, it is sort of you kind of have to go learn how to do this and how to deposit things to Zenodo and where to post your DOIs and things like that. But I think if we're writing scientific software, um, you can just ignore this aspect of things, but I really think that we should not. If we're going to try and make software a first class element in the ecosystem of things that we get credit for, we should really always make sure that our software is citable. Contribution statement. So this is a statement about if you want to get involved in this project. Can you? How? In most cases, for most new projects, it is okay if your feeling is, I do not want people contributing to this. Like if you send me a suggestion, I will probably ignore it. That can be your choice, but you should at least spell out what your choice is about that, because a lot of our software is open source. Part of the key elements of open source is, can I get involved in this project? If so, how so? Maybe I could submit a pull request, but there isn't really a path to steering the direction of the project as a whole. This is the kind of thing that is important to document in this world of software in particular. Reference material, you certainly need some. but I really want to, part of the construction of this checklist is emphasizing it is not the most important thing in this sort of initial documentation. Uh, Probably if you can document all your APIs, command line interfaces, file formats, things like that, that's good and important. But if you put out software where your reference material is kind of sketchy, but the rest of the stuff is there, I think your software is going to be plenty successful. If people say, hey, I need to understand how this API works, they'll tell you, and then you can write that documentation. Um, Next one, licensing statement. So this, once again, this is no one wants to think about this stuff, but you kind of have to. Like technically, if you don't provide information about licensing, if you ask a lawyer, they'll say, well, technically, you're not allowed to use the software at all. You have to tell people about the legal status. Um, so once again, this is something that is more, you have to think about what license should I use? Is it, if you're in the open source domain, there's a few standard choices. If you're not open source, you need to think about more, but it's more about the actual number of words might be in the end, this project is licensed under the MIT license, but you need to do the work to make that statement possible. And finally, once again, something that's more specific to the academic context, acknowledgements. Your work was probably funded by somebody. You probably are supposed to acknowledge them when you do it. There are many things that are not on this list. For instance, like a code of conduct for a project of a certain size, I would say you definitely should have one. If it's just getting started, you can get away without it, I think. I feel that a code of conduct trying to formalize dispute resolution processes like that when a project, if it's literally just you, it's excessive. Once you reach a certain scale, something like that is important. But for this kind of minimum product, it's I've intentionally left it off the list. So I have reference material and tutorial, two of the diataxis elements. Likewise, um, if you're making your initial release and you don't have any explainers or how-to guides, that can be fine. It would be nice to have them, but I don't think you need to have them, even though they're half of the diataxis quartet. Um, One thing that I have is if you satisfy this checklist, and I framed it as a checklist to be, I don't care, how you got here, if you ended up deciding, okay, we don't actually need acknowledgements, no one actually funded this externally. If you've gone over the checklist and you've considered all 9 items, then give yourself a pat on the back and you can put a little badge in the README. There's a link on the website about how to do that. And I think in general, this idea of framing it as a checklist, I hope is useful in that it gives us something that we can aim at tangibly, but also is very agnostic as to how we get there. Like we know when we've reached the goal, but however you want to get there, uh, that's honestly not so important. The product is what's important. That being said, part of the resource is a thing that I call the playbook, which is a step-by-step suggestion of how you can go from a purely blank page to documentation that meets all these items. So in the context of talking about user experience, so what I've done is this is delivered as an HTML slideshow in the website. So I've been doing this more and more, and I've found so it's using a package called reveal.js. It's kind of embedded right in the web page. It doesn't depend on Google Slides or anything. Um, More and more, I feel like this is a very helpful form factor for delivering certain kinds of documentation content. You can imagine we're probably all familiar with this sense of a wall of text. When you've got this page that just goes on and on and on and on, like it might be lots of good information that is worth reading. It can just feel like a real drag to try and make your way through that wall of text. And the slideshow approach breaks it up a little bit, makes things more bite-sized. Like I think there's a reason that people do use slideshows as sort of the digital version of, people will send things around as slide decks when they could be single documents. But there's something about the experience of paging through a slideshow that it makes them a little bit more approachable, I think. Um, so that's one, and I've used that for this playbook element, which is something like 19 steps that are mostly quite straightforward. So some of the more distinctive things. So we suggest that you create kind of a separate note document about your documentation and things like your install instructions or your citations. just draft them there in something like a Google Doc and get that stuff kind of stuff done and not worrying about if you're using Python and Sphinx, how to express your stuff in restructured text. Like just get the words out first, and then we can think about how to import them into your documentation authoring tool. Early on, I suggest that people develop a few user personas and keep them in mind while working on their documentation. This is one of those things which is trying to kind of sneak some sort of user-centered design approaches into the process in a way that hopefully isn't too heavy-handed and is genuinely helpful. But yeah, I just like the idea of planting the idea that this is a way to think about how you approach designing your documentation. Um, because the tutorial is the most important thing, we suggest storyboarding it early on. Again, not diving straight into trying to create the finished but trying to draft it out, think through what the experience will be like, and then actually write it in depth later. And throughout this playbook, there are links to in-depth guides that for all the particular topics go into more depth and are more linear how-tos written in prose that explain things. Um, so this is a list of the guides that are here right now. So these are how-tos in the diataxis sense. Uh, Specifically, I've written them in a style which is, when I think of the how-to approach, I think of people saying like, don't teach me, just tell me what to do. So that's what I try to do as much as I can. I have lots of examples, a few case studies. Um, One thing that I do is I have some advice on tools, but I ended up, it would have been a big extra project to try and provide, a full template of here are all the files that you need to import into your Python project to have, a standard Sphinx setup that does everything right and has a really nice template and, modern tooling and all that stuff. And of course, that's only gonna be relevant to a certain subset of people. So I try to provide some advice about particular documentation tools. For instance, what I say is, if you're using Python, you should almost definitely use Sphinx as your authoring tool. There are a lot of options. I'm not saying that Sphinx is the best one, but if you have to ask me to tell you what to do, I'd say start with that, change it if you need to. But trying to get more specific than that, you run this combinatorial explosion of languages and tools and all sorts of special cases, and it's just really hard to provide any kind of generically useful advice there. The guides also try to have references to external resources. I reference Diataxis a lot, the good docs project templates, resources, and write the docs. And I'm certainly interested in beefing up the number of other things that I reference out to. Behind the scenes, this project is pretty straightforward. So it's a static website built using a tool called Zola that I like a lot. It's served on GitHub pages, and the source code is on GitHub, where the link is. One thing that I'll mention that is a little bit more interesting is I use a lot of release automation using a tool called Cranko, which I will admit that I wrote myself because I was frustrated with the lack of tools to enable this sort of thing. So I won't go into the details, but Cranko, I think, has some neat design features that allow me to do things like the software, essentially, the website knows its own DOI. So when I'm releasing a new version, uh, it will pre-register with Zenodo, get that pre-registered DOI, and then embed it in the actual website content. And so, for instance, on the About page, I can say, you are reading this particular version, its DOI is this particular DOI, here's sample BibTeX with that DOI. And all of this is done essentially in a push button way where I can write up the release notes and push it to GitHub, and then the automation takes care of the rest. And really leaning into automating these kinds of release processes has changed my life. You can apply it for standard, executable software as well as things like websites. And yeah, I find it truly transformative, especially when it comes to things like depositing every release to Zenodo, which I'm doing using their DOI versioning. A couple other things to mention for analytics. I use a tool called Goat Counter, which has a little silly name, but it's privacy respecting and free for kind of modestly scale projects. It seems to be, I think, the best available option to get some kind of insight into what people are doing without, some of the kind of commercial, especially the ones that are free but commercial. Obviously, they're free because they're harvesting all the information about you and your users. and they're very invasive. So I think that's, you know, often not preferred. And then things like making sure to embed tags in the HTML headers so that if someone mentions a page on social media, it has a nice little preview and summary, stuff like that. More and more, that's the kind of hoops that you have to jump through, even for a very kind of basic resource like this, uh, in order to really plug it into the modern web ecosystem. So, just we can ask, is one good tutorial compliant with itself? So the about page essentially is the thing that covers the kinds of elements that uh, are documentation of the site itself. Um, so the intro paragraph is a bit longer than the recommended synopsis, but if you're on the landing page, that kind of, it's the about page, so it is a little bit more in detail. This doesn't have a tutorial because it's not a piece of software. It's not something that you learn how to use. You just consult it. So actually, in the thing that I say is the one most important thing, I think it's reasonable to say that the documentation of one good tutorial itself does not need a tutorial. I've got a section on contact information, install instructions, also not really relevant. I've got citation instructions, got a contribution statement, reference material. Once again, I would say not especially relevant for this thing, but I do have the licensing statement and acknowledgments. And in general, so what I've prepared here is aimed at less formal scientific software projects. If you're more formal, if you've got an actual specification of what docs you need to deliver, if you've got a team working on it, you're going to be approaching things in a different way. I'm assuming an open source style, although a lot of this doesn't have any particular dependency on whether you're open source or not. Um, but regardless, I hope that a lot of these elements will be helpful in a variety of contexts. Like, this checklist, for instance, as I've just run through for this particular documenting one good tutorial itself, about half of it is actually not relevant. But that's fine. It is still helpful, I hope, to think, oh yeah, I should have a contribution statement. I should have a licensing statement. That is relevant for this project, even though it isn't executable software. So that's all the material that I prepared. So a couple more links. Yeah, and so this was done with the support of Better Scientific Software Fellowship, which has been great. This is the kind of thing that I've wanted to work on for a long time, but haven't been able to, and the fellowship made that possible. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much. That was really very interesting. I really liked it. I don't know, do you want the questions to be recorded as well, or
Sure, I'm
okay,
happy either way.
sounds good. I'll start with just saying that I think when a lot of people think about documentation, they're thinking about the reference docs. Like that's their first, like, oh, I need to have that before I can release it. And it's also, at least in my experience, one of the harder things to do. Um, Even especially, so I typically work on web interfaces. So like documenting what each button does, with like arrows and everything is like, oh, that could be so daunting. Um, and I admit to the sin of not always doing it because I'm like, okay, I'm just going to document the most used things and that sort of thing. So um, I was glad to hear you say that it wasn't the most important part of having good documentation.
Yeah, I mean, like I think that like literally down to the name of the whole project, is trying to emphasize that yeah, there's more to it than that, and especially in scientific software, like I have some software that does do synchrotron spectrum calculations, and your reference documentation could go into like what is the definition of synchrotron radiation and what are the inner like I mean your reference documentation could be a textbook of particle physics. Like it is doing it's really hard to sort of draw the boundary of where that stuff needs to stop. And so I don't feel that I have come up with great advice to offer about like what is enough for that minimal product. but I do want to try and plant really firmly, like, you could do less than you think you need, and it will probably be okay. As long as you have contact information and a tutorial, you could probably get away with other things being missing. I see Drew has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. This is fun work. One of the things I'm thinking about more and more these days is not only are we designing docs for humans, but also for AI agents. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about documentation design in your world or tutorial design and anything that you would do differently for that type of consumption model, I guess, where you have an agent that may mediate between you and your end user. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
so for me, I feel like it's clearest in terms of the reference material. That kind of stuff, like I would not be surprised if in the relatively near future, your interface where a lot of documentation tools need you to basically create like a hierarchy book-like of chapter one, chapter three, section 4.7. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future, the primary way that we'll access reference material will be, a chat prompt and a search, slash search box. And you type something in and, we don't care, oh, it's in section 3.7.4, subsection B. It's, you type in something and something understands the language and surfaces the right material. Um, I'm quite skeptical about a lot of LLM usages, but something that is purely sourced on material that is within the domain of the project, not just pulling something from, randomdudesideas.com, like that feels extremely powerful. And we already, if I'm writing code in a relatively modern editor in IntelliSense, I'm running a function call and it will pop up the arguments to the function. So we're already seeing the sort of, I talk about it like, we're going from, the form factor for a lot of this, that kind of stuff becomes a big bucket. I don't care where it is, it's just in the bucket somewhere and something can fetch it out. Now for tutorials, and I think of those as being very human facing. I don't have any strong opinions about is there a way, for me, that's the kind of thing that I want to write as if I'm imagining that a human is reading it directly and I want to design it for them as well as possible. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some interesting thinking about how, like, what you can use language models to do to improve that experience. Thinking of different learning styles, like maybe there are ways to sort of take, again, the same source material and transform it in ways that work better for people. Um, I'm sure there are people who have interesting thoughts about that. I don't know what they are, though.
Thank you. And yeah, I think it's an interesting evolving space to think about. And I agree on, I hate LLMs for all the slop they pull from, but if you have something curated and organized around, let's say, real information, it can be a useful tool for newcomers to a particular scientific ecosystem.
And one thing I'll point out is I think the bucket model is also pretty important from the authoring side too, because when you do have a documentation tool that does have, okay, part two, reference material, chapter one, definition of synchrotron, chapter two, blah, blah. If you want to add more material, like it's a big leap to be like, I'm going to insert a new chapter between the existing chapters one and two. Um, it's sort of having to organize all that stuff as part of your authoring process adds a lot of friction. Whereas if you can just be like, I will write something and throw it in the bucket, and I can be confident that it will be able to emerge from the bucket when it's needed, that's a lot less friction. And like this is why, like Wikipedia, you don't have to be, oh, I'm adding a new article in, the section on dromedaries. Like you just create a page, it's a flat, morass of everything, and that works really well. And I think that actually is a big reason why Wikipedia has a kind of successful distributed contributor model that a lot of writing projects have trouble achieving.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting because that is one of the things I also struggle with as well as adding in material. I'll just really quickly say a feature that I have not tried at all, but our documentation is through Gitbook. Um, and Gitbook offers, it's free for academics, and it offers a free MCP server of your documentation. I haven't tried using it to see how it works or if it's any good, but it is a service that they offer.
Yeah, and I think we'll see as much of a skeptic as I am of a lot of the vampires that run that industry. Like those kinds of applications just seem like complete slam dunks. I see Beth has a hand up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. So a big part of what I do is contribute to our user guides for our supercomputers. And it always kind of comes down to like, we're like, oh, we need to have a tutorial. Or no, it's a how-to. Or like, when do you decide when it's a tutorial or a how-to? Because they're really kind of the same in some ways, right? So like, I don't know, how do you decide like when it's going to be called a tutorial versus when you're going to call it a how-to?
Yeah, so in my mind, the key distinction is a tutorial for me is like for someone who knows that a thing exists, but like isn't really sure what it is.
Mhm.
Like, okay, a tutorial on Slurm is gonna be, you know, basically I'm teaching you what Slurm is by having you do some stuff. Run a job, see, that it takes some time to complete whatever. Um, so it's like it's the person who says like I've been told that I need to learn Slurm. I don't know
Where to start?
what it is at all. Whereas the how-to guide is more for the like I would have the how-to guide on how to launch array jobs in Slurm. I know that I need to launch array jobs. Um, then like this is how I do it. There's definitely it is in that two-dimensional space that Diataxis lays out of like, okay, like maybe I know that I think I need to do something with array jobs, but I'm not sure what they are. Um, so maybe I need a tutorial on array jobs. But I think the ideal like how to can be very brief. Like it's more like the recipe of, okay, you like need to launch an array job and have some kind of output land in a directory with the job ID munged into the output file name. If it's 4 steps of bam, 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 um, that's I think the how-to is like if you can imagine it being written in a really terse style, that isn't, yeah, we're not teaching anybody anything. We're saying do this, do this, do this. Like basically a FAQ section, your traditional FAQ. I think you could think of it as a collection of extremely short how-tos. And one reason that people write FAQs, I think, is once again, they're this bucket of tiny
Yeah.
how-tos where you don't need to worry about how to organize them. You just throw them in there.
So how do you feel, follow up is, how do you feel about using videos for uh, tutorials or how-tos? Or
I
do you
think
think it,
it depends on, like, for instance, I've been involved in some astronomical visualization software, which does sort of interactive stuff in Jupyter Lab. Like there, videos totally make sense. It's interactive software. We're showing, oh, you can zoom in, click on this. Um, I feel like there's some mysterious thing in the general industry driving people to make a bunch of videos of things that don't need it. But surely there are cases that do call for it. And personally, like I love reading reams of text. I don't know if it's purely that there are a lot of people who don't want that, or
yeah,
it feels like
we
the
always
lean
hear
to video.
the kids want videos.
Yeah.
Make it a video.
But it's I mean, just in terms of the authoring effort, my usual mental model is if you want to make a video that, is an hour long, it's got to take 10 hours of work. Like authoring is hard, editing and updating is really hard. Um, so like just pragmatically, if you don't have a lot of resources, I think it makes sense to lean into text. One thing I'll mention, tying in with something earlier, for some of the software I've worked on, I've used these slideshows with very brief videos showing, very particular operations. And I felt that's worked well, where it's, making like literally just showing click here, something that lasts a second. Um, is not too much of an authoring overhead. It's relatively maintainable. If I need to redo it, I don't have to redo some whole long thing. And embedding those in a slideshow, I feel like can kind of balance getting the good parts of video without making it too much of a drag to produce them. Hannah, I see a hand.
Yeah, I like the scaffolding approach this is how I'm interpreting the one good tutorial, just bite-sized bits until you can do something larger. Um, but I'm thinking about how a lot of the time people wait to do documentation until like pretty far into their project and um, they're the developers, they've been working with it for a long time, and their perspective is really different from a newcomer's. Do you have suggestions on how to kind of, yeah, assume that perspective, like, and not uh, assume any extra knowledge?
Uh, that's a good question. I feel like that's maybe something like I should add some discussion of that because yeah, I try hard to, not have those blinders on, but it certainly does happen a lot. And um I think you can like one thing I don't recommend is user testing, like, oh, show this to a person and or maybe I actually do recommend that in the tutorial discussion, but you can conceive of that much more broadly. Um, so yeah, I think that's an important point and one that I actually don't really think I address very well right now. Um, it's not obvious to me, like it's a tough problem. It's not obvious to me how to solve it, but yeah, I think having a few, I'll try and think about if there's anything kind of tangible I can recommend. Um, like hopefully, I mentioned coming up with some user personas. I try and sort of embed this idea of like thinking about the other person as opposed to just writing down some stuff that you remember about the definition of the axis argument. Um, so hopefully that sort of spills out, but I should really make it explicit. Like, um, yeah, maybe we could talk more about that sometime.
Yeah, thanks. And if you do have anything you want to share, I'm sure the working group would like to see it in the Slack channel, so please do.
Cool.
Does anyone have any final questions or comments? Got a bunch of thank yous from people who had to leave in the chat, just so you know. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and I have to hop off too. So thanks a lot. I'll throw my email in the chat and a couple other links just before I go. But yeah, thanks so much for tuning in and happy documenting, I guess.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for presenting.